Good afternoon. Thanks to everyone who's joining us in person and virtually online. I'm Dr. Stacie Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. And I'm honored today to have with me the Honorable Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force. Welcome, Secretary.
Thanks, Stacie. Good to be here.
We are going to be talking broadly about one of the Secretary's favorite topics, that is the U.S.'s great power competition with China, and what the Department of the Air Force is doing to modernize and prepare itself so that it can strengthen deterrence against the pacing challenge of China. In particular, however, a focus point of our conversation is going to be on budgetary uncertainty, which is a self-inflicted wound that we seem to keep suffering from, and that threatens progress on some of these plans. So I'm planning to leave ample time for questions from the audience online and in person at the end. If you have a question and are in the online audience, please submit it in the chat screen at the bottom, and be sure to identify yourself because we don't take anonymous questions. With all of that, I'm going to dive into it here. Secretary, since you have taken over the Department of the Air Force, you have had a laser focus on China. And you have set the course for the Air and Space Forces by identifying 7 key operational imperatives that are critical to actually winning this competition. You've been consistent with these goals and you've been making progress along the way. What remains to be done and what are the biggest obstacles to achieving these 7 objectives?
In a word, money. We're waiting for budgets. You know, when I came in, we identified the operational imperatives, that list of 7, as the key things, the key problems that we need to solve. All of them required a degree of modernization, and all of them required budgetary actions. So we spent the first several months figuring out what the most cost-effective investments would be, put them into our budget starting in '24, and went to OSD as we went through our budget process, and we got a lot of support out of OSD for what we had done. We got additional resources. And there were about $30 billion over the 5-year plan that are currently associated with the operational imperative initiatives. $5 billion of that is in '24 alone. We're still waiting for that money. So we've been spending, we spent a few months trying to solve the problem, and now we're spending what's going to be years potentially trying to get the funds to actually address it. This is all time that we're giving away to China to move forward. And I can tell you that China is moving forward very aggressively and has been for a very long time now in their modernization program. We can't afford to sit still.
That's absolutely true. It seems like we have admired the problem for a very long time and taken a long time to actually begin to implement some of the needed changes across the department that need to be made, whether it's posture, new platforms, new operational concepts, and that we really can't afford to let further time go by and waste. Is there one particular imperative that you would highlight as being either particularly farther ahead or behind the others?
They're all just what the language says. They're all imperative. They're all things we need to do. The first one, space order battle, is the broadest. And the short version of this is that we essentially have a Space Force that is a bit like a country having a merchant marine. And we woke up and realized we needed a Navy. We got to build the Navy. The Air Force is a different situation. It needs to modernize, but it doesn't need to start from the same place. We have a small number of satellite systems that were designed with the assumption of impunity, that they wouldn't be attacked. That's no longer true. We need to have resilient capabilities in space. We also need to have the capabilities to go after what the other side is putting in space. China's been pursuing targeting systems, basically, that are linked to its longer range, increasingly longer range precision weapons, and coming after some of our highest value assets. So we cannot let them have that capability with impunity. We need counter space capabilities as well. And of course, we need battle management to tie it all together. So that first one really encompasses many of the things we need to do for the Space Force. If you walk down the list, the others, C3 battle management in general, for the Air Force and Space Force, we have some things in place, but we have to modernize them and get to the next generation. Part of that has been organizational, part of that has been funding. the targeting capabilities that we need to support the joint force, largely space also, but with some airborne capabilities as well. And then finally, next on the list is air superiority. The next generation air dominance platform, but the accompanying uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft, the uncrewed systems that will be controlled from that manned aircraft, are very important in making that family of systems work. The resiliency of our air bases, particularly in the Pacific, is critical to our success. Those are some of the high-value targets that China is targeting and coming after. And then long-range strike capabilities. The B21 just flew, and there's a family of systems associated with the B21, and we need to move that into production and move it forward as quickly as we can. And then finally, there are a mix of things that we count on in order to transition from peacetime to wartime, to mobilize and to actually move the force forward and fight it successfully. So I wouldn't say that any one was more important than the others. They're all part of a set that are first and foremost about deterrence, about convincing China that any day that they wake up is not a good day to start a war. But we need to move quickly forward. That there is all of these things are going to take time. And so the sooner we start, the sooner we can get them done.
Definitely. The department does not typically move very rapidly by most people's standards on anything, so delays are particularly disruptive. So let's talk about the budget a little bit and the uncertainty in terms of the budget, because we are on a continuing resolution that is set to expire at the end of this week. There have been debates and holds on reprogramming request, which is one of the few areas of flexibility within the annual budget. There's been a lot of discussion and no resolution in terms of aid packages for Israel and additional aid for Ukraine. And a whole bunch of flag officer and general officer promotions have been held up in the Senate because of sort of gridlock and on that side. So it's really hard right now to predict what is going to happen in the next week, let alone the next month. We could have a government shutdown. We could have another continuing resolution. How does this uncertainty impact the Air and Space Forces and the implementation of these different initiatives that you had just outlined?
It basically brings them to a screeching halt. Just taking the operational imperatives, there are about a dozen or more new starts, things that we need congressional authorization to start. So not having an authorization bill yet, not having an appropriations bill, this means we have to wait until those things are passed to begin. We do have a legislative initiative in front of the Congress. I call it the Quick Start Initiative, that will allow us to at least get early phase, low cost preliminary work started while we're waiting for congressional approval. And I'm hopeful that that'll be approved this year and give us a little bit more flexibility in the future. But right now, under the rules we're operating under, we can't start major new programs until we get approval from the Congress. And under a normal circumstance, that takes over a year. And if we have a CR, it adds time to that. If we have a year-long CR, I'm looking at the possibility that my entire tenure in office will be spent waiting for money from the Congress. I will have identified in the first few months what we need to do, asked the Congress for that money, and then spent the entire rest of the term waiting for that money to be appropriated.
That has to be incredibly frustrating. So I'd like to pull a little bit on this quick start concept, because you hear about some of the proposals out there to expedite the delivery of new programs or technologies that involve maybe advanced funding for long lead items. Is this essentially that, or is it something more?
I've been advocating for this for decades, because the way our process is set up is we do our planning, and then we go through a long deliberation process, and then we ask the Congress for a budget, and then we wait on the order of 9 months to a year for them to actually pass the bills and provide the money. All of that time is time we're ceding to China. We're in a race for military technological superiority. There's no question about that, and they're moving forward very quickly. And I identified that personally in 2010, well over 12 years ago when I came back to government in 2010. You mentioned that in your opening comment. So we need to move quickly, and just giving away time that we could use doesn't make any sense to me. We were talking earlier about the impact of a CR. Think of it this way. If you're doing a race that's a mile long, we're essentially giving away a quarter-mile head start to the other side. Quarter mile. You know, if you add up over 4 years, those 3 or 4 periods of 3 months that we customarily now don't have appropriations or authorizations, that's like a quarter of our time. You're giving away an entire lap in a 4-lap race to the other side to move ahead while you're sitting still. That makes no sense whatsoever.
It doesn't. I think it's very hard for people to sometimes understand the nuances of this because continuing resolutions have become so common, as you noted. And there have been, every year since FY 1977, except for 3, there has been a continuing resolution, which is kind of astonishing. Can you unpack a little bit what makes this so challenging, besides not being able to start new programs, and why the Air Force and Space Force haven't just been able to adapt because they expect this? What are the constraints that prevent you from being able to make adjustments to this new sort of normal?
Well, first of all, it's a criminal act to spend money you don't have from the Congress, so we can't spend money we don't have yet. And by the way, the Quick Start Initiative isn't pointed at CRs. It's pointed at the normal process, which already cost us roughly a year in lost time, year to a year and a half. CRs add to that, so it's really not about CRs for me, it's about the normal process. But the implications are widespread. Basically, you can't increase funding on things that you would plan to increase funding on. So ramping up production rates. In many development programs, you have a profile which increases over the first few years of the program. So you're forced to keep that flat. A good example of that is our C3 battle management system, the Advanced Battle Management System, which is the Air Force and Space Force as part of Joint All-Domain Command and Control. We intend to double the budget for that effort in '24. So we would be kept at half the rate at which we're prepared to spend if the bills don't pass or until they pass. So that has a big impact. You can't hire people, you can't put contracts in place, and if you do, you have to limit the scope of work of them. In the case of production programs, you can't do multi-years and you can't increase production rates in programs where you'd plan to do that. So it just holds us back. It's like it's just an anchor, keeping us moving forward.
Yeah. You see there have been all these efforts to find ways to boost production, especially of things like munitions, because of the increased demand we've seen with Ukraine and now the war between Israel and Hamas. And one of those has been what you mentioned, multi-year procurement, which was in the last budget request and has been authorized by parts of Congress, but the funds haven't been appropriated for that. I saw that Chris Gordon had an article earlier in Air and Space Forces magazine sort of detailing some of the potential implications of a continuing resolution or shutdown. And one of the ones identified was munitions. He mentioned JASM, but more broadly for multi-year procurement, I'm really interested in some of the areas where there are current gaps or deficiencies. So the new air-to-air missile that the Air Force is developing, as well as additional anti-ship missiles, which are needed for the priority challenge. Do you see these being impacted by a shutdown or continuing resolution?
Absolutely. We have 3 multi-year requests for weapons before the Congress. AMRAAM, air-to-air missile, LRASM, anti-ship missile, and JASM-ER, another anti-surface missile, basically. All with a degree of standoff that's important to us for survivability and effectiveness. When we pass multi-years, when we give industry the knowledge that we're going to do that, that's an incentive to industry to make capital investments to improve capacity and to strengthen their supply lines. So there's a lot of benefits. It also gets us lower costs. So there are really good reasons to do multi-years where you're confident that you want to go ahead and continue with those programs. The other program that's really important to us, it's one where we want to increase the funding, is a joint advanced tactical missile, air-to-air missile that is the follow-on to AMRAAM. That's an essential weapon system for us to maintain air superiority in the future, and we really need to get that into production as soon as we can. There are a number of these that cross the Department of Defense. We need the wars in support to Ukraine have drawn down a lot of the Army's munitions, and we're drawing down other munitions in some cases to support Israel right now. So we need replacement funds for these. And we need to, traditionally, we have not funded munitions to the level we should, quite frankly. So a lot of what we're doing in this current budget and future budgets is to bring them back up to a more reasonable rate of procurement.
Yes, I talked to Dr. LaPlante about that previously, and Hannah Dennis and I had written 2 reports looking at munitions now, and it just seems like uncertainty for munitions is even greater than for larger weapon systems, and that this is just going to be compounded. We hear again and again from folks who work in the defense industry that all of the uncertainty really paralyzes them because they just can't make those investments because it's not a wise choice and something that their shareholders would support. So hopefully those will actually get an appropriated budget, and it will include multi-year procurement for some of those key munitions.
I'm cautiously optimistic, and we've had good relationships with our 4 committees that oversee the Department of the Air Force, certainly, and I think more generally the Department of Defense. On both sides of the aisle, our committees are largely highly supportive of national security and adequate investments in national security. It's when we get into the machinations of the entire Congress that things tend to slow down.
Yeah. So we've talked a good bit about Quick Start, but actually accelerating acquisition, I know it is a priority of yours. It is had been the entire focus of your work in a prior incarnation in the department, and it's something that we've been focusing on here at CNAS with a new Defense Technology Task Force that we just stood up that is co-chaired by Bob Work, Ellen Lord, and Mike Brown, and Andrew Metrick. And we're trying to focus on near-term changes that don't require necessarily new authorities or changes to legislation. I'm wondering if you had any other ideas of things that should be done right now to help to get capabilities in the hands of the warfighter faster.
I'm going to be a little countercultural, I guess, in some circles anyway. We don't have an innovation problem. We have a money problem. We know what we need to buy. We know where to buy it from. We need the money to buy it. That's really where we are right now. There is a very long list of things that I would love to buy for the Department of the Air Force that I can't afford to fund. We have a tendency in the last few years at least to have started too many projects. We can't afford them all. We need to be more focused and more disciplined about starting things that we really do intend to take into production field. My general guidance to my acquisition team is I want program structure to get meaningful capability as quickly as possible. And I'm not interested in 1 or 2 of something. I'm interested in getting to production and getting the quantity out there that our warfighters need as quickly as we can. But you've got to start that by picking the things that you really want and getting on with them. And we've got lots of sources of technology we can tap into. We've got DARPA, we've got DIU, we've got SCO, we've got AFRL, of course, our own internal research organization, and we're well aware of what's happening in the commercial world and so on, and very prepared to take advantage of that, particularly in areas like space. But what we really need is the resources to move forward.
Yeah, you know, in the private sector, you want to let 1,000 flowers bloom, but in the department, it seems like there has been far too much of that and a lot of innovation sort of gestures and theater that haven't actually come to full fruition, which is very frustrating when you know that there are a lot of technologies out there that we have in our private lives that the department hasn't been able to integrate yet into its operations and its weapons.
There's some interesting analogies to the private sector and some misconceptions too. The private sector doesn't do innovation for the sake of innovation. It does innovation to make money. Mm-hmm. It does innovation to develop products that will sell and to get them to market as quickly as it can. And we have the same imperative. We need to develop products that we want to put in the hands of our warfighters to make them more capable as quickly as we can. And we need to stay focused on that.
Yeah. So one of the areas that the Air Force is making investments that is not simply a conventional weapon are the nuclear capabilities, yes. Since you are responsible for 2 legs of the triad with the B21 bomber and the Sentinel new ICBM. I was fortunate to be out in California last year and to see the unveiling, and now the B-21 recently has flown. So how do you expect these programs to progress, and are they going to be able to stay on track?
Yeah.
And given all of the funding uncertainty? Because, I mean, they're both critical and so important given what we're seeing with respect to China in terms of its nuclear buildup, concerns going on with Russian nuclear saber rattling, North Korea. They're just systems that we can't simply forget and continue to put off like we have for the past few decades.
I'm laughing because I'm often asked to make predictions about programs. And my advice to political appointees I've worked with for decades has been never say something positive about a program that's in development. They all have risk, and there is a good chance that whatever program it is, no matter how well it's done to date, it's going to get in trouble in the future. So I'm the best I can give you is cautiously optimistic. I'm fairly optimistic comparatively about the B21, partly because Bill LaPlante and I put that program together with the RCO back in the Obama administration. And it's been executing to the plan that we put in place pretty well. Minor slips internally, but nothing dramatic. And as you noted, it's flying now. It's in flight test. Now that's an important milestone. We've got a ways to go in the flight testing, and then we've got obviously to go through production and make that work. But where we are with the program, I think I can say, cautious optimism is warranted. But we can still find issues that we have to address, and I expect we will. Sentinel is one of the most large, complex programs I've ever seen. It's probably the biggest thing in some ways that the Air Force has ever taken on, because it's a vast real estate development, civil engineering program, a fairly vast communications command and control program, as well as, of course, the missile itself. And when we put that program together, the early stages of it, we had a huge uncertainty in the cost estimate. This was when I was in my previous position. And that was early on, before the program was well defined. It was baselined and put into place during the previous administration after I left office. I'm recused because of an industry association I had when I was out of government from both B21 and Sentinel. So I can't make any decisions about those programs. I get to watch and hope for the best. So far, B21's doing fine. Sentinel, I think, is quite honestly struggling a little bit. There are unknown unknowns that are surfacing that are affecting the program, and that the department's going to have to work its way through, I think. So I'm more nervous of the two about Sentinel at this time. They're both essential programs. We have to do them. Somebody asked me about being willing to fail on programs. I said, well, there are some programs you cannot fail on. This is one of them. These two are both of these as part of the triad of programs we must succeed at getting fielded.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to procurement, you've launched a recent effort to re-optimize the Air Force, which is pretty grand in terms of its scope. It's looking at organization, equipment, personnel, readiness, and supporting the force. I'm going to tie this into a question from one of our audience members online, Amanda, which is about how is the Air Force thinking about talent management. I know the Space Force is too, as a part of the larger conversations around force modernization and this reorganization. So what can you tell us about this effort?
Talent management is really important, both for acquisition and operationally and for other reasons. The effort that we have going on now, which we just kicked off a month or two ago, about re-optimizing for great power competition, is about, to a large extent, it's about the rest of the things the Air Force does. I came into office in 2021 already aware that we needed to do some things on the modernization side, that we needed to identify and get on with the next generation of capabilities. And I knew that from my previous role. I didn't appreciate the degree to which we need to make other change, as General Brown characterizes it, accelerate change or lose. Well, as time has gone on, myself and the other leadership in the Air Force and Space Force have identified other areas where we need to change. And the re-optimizing for great power competition is a very broad effort. There are 5 lines of effort we're pursuing. We have one on how we're organized, one on how we equip the force, one on people, which gets at the talent management, includes training, one on support functions, and then one on readiness itself, how we create, sustain, and measure and assess our own readiness posture, and make sure that it is as high as we can keep it across the force. So we've had teams organized to work those 5 areas. It's still a work in progress. We expect to make some decisions in the January timeframe and then start rolling out implementation in February. Talent management is very much a part of that. And the question there is, do we have the right skill sets? Do we have the right expertise in the Air Force? Do we have enough people that are cultural experts on China and on the Pacific? Do we have people who understand modern technology, IT and AI and cybersecurity and so on as much as they should? Do we have people who are ready to apply some of these emerging technologies to military applications? And in general, is our technical aspects of the department as strong as it needs to be for competition with the kind of competitor we have? So we're addressing all of those things and looking for ways to attract and retain more people, identify the right mix that we need, and then staff to it. We're looking at things like dedicated career tracks focused on technical areas, where people who are specialists stay in their specialty through what is a good career track for them, as opposed to the traditional enlisted up through the NCO ranks and the officer up through the officer ranks to higher levels of responsibility and management. What we're looking at for both of those groups of people is something that keeps people on a technical track. And we do this with other fields. We do it with medicine, for example, right? But we're going to need that technical expertise. And some of these fields, continuity is really important to us. Mm-hmm. So all of that has got to be considered, and then how we attract and retain people as part of that process as well. A lot of work to do there.
It definitely is, and it is absolutely essential because we're only as good as our people, and
exactly right.
That is one of the United States military's key advantages. You mentioned readiness, and that ties into issues about global force management and deployments. Mm. My colleague Becca Wasser recently had a report, Campaign of Denial, that is looking at how the department can better manage its regular day-to-day activities to support the overarching goal of deterrence. And I know you've remained focused on China, but the world keeps throwing at us all of these curveballs with a war in Europe, another war in the Middle East that's threatening to expand. I saw that there were F-15 strikes recently in Syria again, against some Iranian-backed militants, I believe. So given all of these competing demands and things in the Pacific are relatively quiet, how are you managing to support all of these activities and to maintain a high overall level of readiness, especially for the high-end fight?
Well, I submit that the Philippine Navy and the Taiwanese Air Force don't think it's all that quiet in the Pacific, but that's a different point of view.
That's fair. And I saw Dr. Ratner's, with the recent videos
Yes.
that they've been releasing, there's a lot of sort of activity that's flying below the radar that people aren't recognizing. But compared to, large-scale war in Europe and the Middle East.
You raise a really good point, Stacie. I've seen the Department of Defense twice in my own personal experience try to focus on the Pacific and be pulled away by events somewhere else, mostly the Middle East. But the first time was in 2001. I was actually working on a Defense Science Board study on the technologies we would need to be more effective in the Pacific. And just after we got that study started, 9/11 occurred. And we then went and spent 20 years doing counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency operations. The second time was in the Obama administration when we had rewritten the strategy. We were emphasizing Asia and the Pacific, and ISIS showed up. And we went into a 3 or 4 year conflict with ISIS, basically supporting Iraq and our partners in Syria. So we have been pulled away from the Pacific multiple times in the past by places who tend to be more violent. The administration, I can say in this case, is not taking its eye off the ball. That the focus on the Pacific and China remains our focus. It's now widely seen as the pacing challenge. That doesn't mean we can't ignore Russia as an acute threat in Europe. It doesn't mean we can ignore events in the Middle East. The United States is the most powerful military in the world, and we have very strong allies and partners. We can handle these other problems. but we have to have a degree of strategic discipline as we do it. And we have to, keep in the center of our focus, what the pacing challenge and the strategic competitor really is, and where it is, and what we need to do to manage that. I think that General Brown, whom I know very, very well from his experience with me, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, brings that perspective to the chairmanship position. And I think that will affect how we do things. It is very difficult to say no to a combatant commander who is experiencing some sort of a crisis and wants reinforcements, essentially. But we're going to have to be judicious about how we do that. We don't have infinite capability, and we're going to have to try to keep our strategic discipline strong, independent of what happens in the world. And I think we can do that. The United States is a very powerful country.
We definitely are. Well, excuse me. We definitely are. It's interesting. We've just developed habits, though, of sort of reflexively sending forces forward, whether they necessarily have a significant effect or not, and thinking more creatively about what else we can do and other ways that we can deter and reassure our allies is something that Becca gives us a lot of insight to in her report. So I'm going to ask one more question on one of my favorite topics right now before I open things up a little bit. I have more questions, but I'm going to try to be really restrained here. My favorite topic, and the one that's on the top of my brain because Hannah, Molly, and I are writing 2 reports right now on it, is drones. And yes. You had talked about this already with the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, which is aiming to develop more of a loyal wingman type platform. Mm-hmm. More recently, Dr. Hicks announced the Replicator initiative, which is looking to develop a large number of low-cost, attritable drones. Are these 2 efforts related? If not, how can you make sure that they end up complementing each other?
They're intended to be complementary. Of that, the billions we have in the 5-year plan, including funding in 24, there's several $1 billion in the 5-year plan for the uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft. It's a centerpiece of operational imperatives. It's a significant development program. We're trying to get the requirements into a right balance between, overreaching and underreaching what we can do there. So we're in the early stages of formulating the definition of that program, but we know roughly what the cost is. It's going to be on the order of a quarter or a third, for example, of an F-35, something on that order. And we know what kind of capabilities we want. So we're working with industry now on some different competing concepts for that. So that's a major acquisition program that's going to take a few years, but we do intend to be in production by the end of the FIDIP with the first increment and field it as quickly as we can in reasonable quantities. The Replicator program is something that's designed to go faster than that. It's broader than that. It's still assessing candidates, and the Air Force has some candidates that we put on the table to be included in Replicator. So we're going through a process to identify them. So I would call the two initiatives, if you will, complementary, basically.
So one's the near term and one's the long term, but they're both aiming to, in some ways, be able to generate mass with uncrewed systems. And generating mass, though, means that you have to be able to buy a lot of them. So they have to be affordable enough because of the money problem that we started our conversation with. So when you're saying a lot of CCAs, are you thinking hundreds, thousands, Yeah,
last spring I announced a planning figure of 1,000.
Okay.
I think it will very likely be more than that. They're not expendables. They're intended to be systems that you can accept losses of a fraction of them and not have a big operational impact. So they need to be able to be produced relatively quickly and in reasonable quantities. At the other end of the spectrum, down closer where I think Replicator is trying to be, you're closer to expendable, and you're closer to the things that you can expect to have significant losses of in an operation. They're all about getting more cost-effective capabilities. But in the case of the Air Force, if we go ahead buying just the NGAD platform and F-35, say, and B-21s as our aircraft, our combat aircraft, you can't afford the Air Force. Those systems are all $100 million plus category, in some cases way beyond that. So we've got to have something that will allow us to have mass at affordable prices. So CCA is designed to do that. Replicator is designed, I think, as I understand the concept, to be more, even larger kinds of numbers, and to some degree consumed in operation, but not entirely, right? And I think that's still a question mark as we work our way through sorting out exactly what systems we're going to pursue in field under Replicator.
Interesting. So I have a question from Tony, and I'm going to try to tie it into a couple of things here. He's asking about whether the Phoenix Ghost is a likely candidate for Replicator, which I think is an Army system, not an Air Force system, and also one that, while it's been reported we have given it to Ukraine, there hasn't been a lot of evidence that it has been widely employed there. But on the Replicator side, from the Air Force candidates, if it's not Phoenix Ghost, are these more of the type of systems that General Hinote was looking at when he was in charge of Air Force Futures, the kitten and cat type of, like a MQ-28 Ghost Bat, or the Valkyrie type platform?
We need something that has range and payload characteristics consistent with our operational concept, which means we're probably smaller than the, class 1 size, very small UAVs, for example. The Skybrook program, which was an Air Force technology program, explored some concepts that are like this. Being able to get away from the use of relatively long runways is a nice feature for us. It makes the aircraft much more survivable. So we're looking at things that would give us that as well. But at the end of the day, you've got to either fly ahead of our company crewed fighters and have range and payload capabilities that are operationally consistent with that. You don't want the full complement of systems that are on a fighter, but you want some subset of that, and you want to be able to carry weapons. So, and in some mix. One of the things you can do with the CCA concept is select which systems in the formation that the manned aircraft controls to carry which sets of capabilities. You have a modular design. The interesting game theory about that is that the other side is required to consider every single one of them as armed. So it has to deal with all of them as an armed threat, which is a big advantage. It's leverage essentially over the other side. The replicator concepts, right, as I understand them, are more expendable than that, don't necessarily have the same kind of range payload characteristics, and therefore can be acquired both in larger quantities potentially and also used more like an expendable potentially. But again, you mentioned Phoenix Ghost. It's an Air Force program.
It is?
And more of an experimental kind of program than anything else.
Okay, I stand corrected. It is one of the things with Replicator that worries me, is that it's seeking to sort of emulate what we've seen the Russians and Ukrainians do with these small loitering munitions or expendable different types of systems. And the distances in the Pacific are so much greater that you're going to either have to deploy those and then timing them. There are all kinds of operational challenges with using.
The Ukrainians have troops in contact, so it's a very different environment. One of the things we're doing with the CCA programming is there are actually three parts of that. There's the actual development program, which is getting to the first increment of real capability we're going to field. We're using some of the Ghost Bats, the MQ-28s, as experimental aircraft to get some operational experience teaming them with crewed aircraft. And then we've also got some F-16s, which are optionally manned, that we're using to develop some of the autonomy technology. So we're trying to bring those different elements together into the program that we're going to field to ensure that we've got one that will be successful.
Interesting. Are there any questions from the in-person audience?
How you doing?
Molly will get you the...
Yep.
Thank you, Stacie, and thank you, sir. Chris Gordon, Air and Space Forces Magazine. If I could follow up on something you said about Sentinel and the unknowns that have caused some struggles. What are the known knowns that are causing some struggles, and do you still believe it's feasible to get that in that 2030 timeline and then build it out in 5-6 years is currently envisioned?
I'm hesitant to say much because I'm recused, okay? But it's the thing that I noticed years ago when we did the Milestone A, the thing that drove our uncertainty was the number of decades since we'd done this. It's been a very long time since we did an ICBM. We also had to go into all of those complex real estate deployment, the missile fields, plus the launch control complexes, et cetera, all the command and control infrastructure. And we had to go assess all that to see what might need to be replaced and how hard a job that was going to be. And that was one of the sources of unknown unknowns. So as we get more into the program, as we understand more deeply what we're actually going to have to do, we're finding some things that are going to cost money. There's no question about that. And we're trying to assess how much of an impact that's going to have and what kind of adjustments we're going to have to make because of it.
If I could just quickly follow up on the sort of the topic of this conversation. Dr. LaPlante's talked about some ideas to build things ahead of time and reduce the risk. How much does a CR hurt the Sentinel program?
I don't have a specific answer on the CR and Sentinel. We can try to get you that, and I'd be speculating if I told you what it is. I'm kind of arm's length from it because I'm recused.
Lauren.
Thank you, sir. Lauren Fish, L3 Harris. Good to see you.
Hi.
Has there been any indication from, I'm sure you've communicated with the PPBE Commission, but any indication that that effort is going to lead to some of the effort and alleviate some of the challenges around getting budget dollars quickly, maybe things like mission-based or portfolio planning so that you can get that quick start dollars quicker when you have a priority shift or a program slip, et cetera? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I had a chance to talk to them, and I know Bob Hill and Ellen Lord really well, and a number of people on the commission. I think some of their recommendations can be helpful. I don't know that they're revolutionary. I've been through their report, maybe not in great detail. The portfolio management piece is a highlight, and we used to do something back 30 or 40 years ago when I was in the Pentagon, where we did mission areas, where we did management by mission areas. And there's a concept that was kind of coming into more popularity when I left office in the Obama administration, on kind of mission engineering, basically. And I think those things are pretty sound, and if we do them, we can get to sounder decisions. One of the things that I'm trying to do in the Department of the Air Force with this re-optimizing for great power competition is to establish organizations whose purpose in life is to keep us ahead in the competition. What we have right now, particularly in the acquisition side, is PEOs, Program Executive Officers, who have portfolios of programs. And their purpose in life is to deliver those programs on schedule and under cost. We need people who are not just doing that, but also following and investing in the new technologies we need, figuring out how to work with operators to make them into operational concepts that'll make sense, and then setting them up and reducing risk so that they can get into a PEO's portfolio and then get fielded. So that's something that we just don't have enough of in the Air Force. It's almost by individual initiative that people do that right now. So we're going to have to strengthen that part of the organization, both on the operational side from the point of view of operational planning and requirements development, and on the technical side from the point of view of technology maturation. And then that'll all have to work together as a partnership. So that approach to, if you will, portfolio management or mission area management is something that we're going to institute. Electronic warfare is a good example of an area where cyber is another, where we need to be staying ahead continuously and not just waiting for the old generation to wear out before we buy the next generation. We need to have a stronger new product pipeline to be competitive than what we have right now.
I'm going to grab a couple questions from the online audience. Byron asks if you can discuss how the holds on Air Force nominations and promotions have impacted the day-to-day functions.
It's devastating. This is horrific. And I think of a stronger term if I could. We're coming up on a year of this. And I looked at the list of people today that are waiting for confirmation. Some of them were picked last February. And basically we do a year planning cycle. So we're about to do the next year. And we haven't moved the people from the last year yet. It's incredibly debilitating. And we handpicked people for jobs they were best suited for. Mm-hmm. And what's happening right now is whoever happens to be there, often a deputy or somebody, in some cases, many cases, people who stayed on instead of retiring, we do not have the leaders in place. Now, a former football coach ought to understand that you don't field the winning team unless you put your best players and your people in the best position for them to play in, and you keep, you put the A team on the field, right? He should understand that. But the impact he's having with this is really horrific. And these are people who had nothing to do with the policy. They're career professionals. Many of them have served in combat. Their families are deeply affected by this. There's a whole cascading tiers of people who are affected by this, waiting for these moves to occur and these promotions to occur. This has got to stop. And all the service secretaries have been very vocal. The Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense have been very vocal. A number of Republicans now have been very, very outspoken against it and deeply appreciative of that. Chairman Reed, my classmate from West Point, chair of the Armed Services Committee, is been engaged on this from day one, trying to reverse this. And they're pushing forward a rules change, which I hope goes through. It's intended to affect just this group of people, but get them through so that we can get on with things. We have important business to do, and this is not helping at all. It's very debilitating.
Yeah, I've been relieved to see, that General Alvin and General Brown were confirmed and others, but
the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, clearly there's a whole mountain underneath that that needs to also move through to actually make things function well and as they should. Shelley online asked a question about, rather than adding more money to your budget request, is there a place that you can slim down to sort of balance the budget and increase the funding for modernization? I know these are drills that you've been through before, for sure.
I'm smiling because it's been, one of my more interesting parts of my position here is retiring old airplanes and the reluctance to retire old airplanes, particularly if it means significantly affecting a base or a unit and the state we're in or the district, congressional district, where those airplanes reside. I want to say that I've had good support for this. We've made the case, I think, pretty successfully to draw down the A-10s, and we've been working our way through that. We've got a tranche. We did a tranche last year in Indiana, and this year we've got a tranche mostly at Davis-Monthan. And so we're moving forward incrementally with the A-10s. What we're trying very hard to do is replace fighters with fighters where we can. If we can't do that, we replace fighters with a flying mission of some kind. And if we can't do that, we try to replace them with an enduring mission. The needs of the Air Force are changing. We need more, we talked about uncrewed aircraft earlier. We need ISR, we need reconnaissance and surveillance. We need battle management, we need cybersecurity. We need IT in general, information related skill sets and units. And we need to move forward with those. So hanging on to everything we have is not the way to be competitive with China. And I am appreciative of the support we've gotten and the progress we've been able to make so far. There was resistance on retiring some of the older F-22s this past year. They're not combat capable, and it would be exorbitantly expensive to make them that. And the balance of the force that would remain, we are upgrading and will keep for quite some time. So anyway, there are opportunities like that. We have excess installations, but there's been no political will or interest in doing anything about that. If this were a business and you're responsible to a board of directors and trying to manage it as effectively as you can for taxpayer value, we would be making some different decisions though than the ones we're making about getting rid of non-productive assets, I'll just put it that way, and focusing on things that are going to give us a greater return.
Becca.
Hi, sir. Becca Wasser from CNAS. You've talked a lot about operational concepts, and I want to ask you about the impact of a CR, or at least some of the uncertainty in your planning around that for executing operational concepts. And it strikes me that there are challenges in two areas. The first is, the Air Force's ability to exercise and experiment, right? To gain some of those critical warfighting skills that they would need to execute those concepts, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The second is posture, where there's a lot of upgrades to runways in the Indo-Pacific that are needed, some of the base hardening and resiliency measures that you mentioned as part of your operational imperatives, but also thinking about the opportunity of some of the new EDCA sites in the Philippines. Those probably require a great deal of buildup at this point in time to be able to actually operate from them. So can you talk a little bit more about how you see some of the impacts of the CR on the Air Force's ability to execute these operational concepts, both now and into the future?
I could have planted that question.
You're welcome. You can pay me later.
One of the things that we can do that has an immediate return is some of the improvements you talked about. And I think it's the fifth operational imperative about resilience of our bases, basically. and making agile combat employment the concept that you don't sit on the fixed base that the other side knows where it is and be a nice target. You move off to other bases on a kind of a hub and spoke concept so that you're harder to target and you present more targets potentially, as many as possible to the adversary. But that means you have to make some investments in those locations. You have to do things like putting the infrastructure in place. You have to buy pre-positioning in some cases, right? So one of the things that we have a lot of money for in the 24 budget is to do just that. So the CR is delaying that. The delaying getting a budget is holding all that work up. You mentioned the fields in the Philippines. I was there about a year ago and was part of a groundbreaking ceremony for improving a runway out there, which will allow us to have more capable operations there. That was something of a coup for Secretary Austin and the administration to pull off. And hopefully there'll be more of those. We're having conversations in Japan about being able to operate off of some of their military bases as well as our own. So we have more flexibility there as well. And some of our partners in other parts of the Pacific offer other opportunities, but they are going to require investment. The operational concept piece, we need to experiment. We need to get the funding for CCA so we can go do some experiments with current forces to learn from that. We've got a little bit of work we need to do to try to expand our ranges so that they're more representative of what the Pacific environment is like in particular, and increase the capabilities of our threats so we can, or the threats that we emulate so that we can operate against them in more realistic operational things and experiment with operational ideas there. So it's all part and parcel of this whole fabric of increasing our overall combat capability, basically.
That's great. We had spoken previously about industry and the defense industrial base's ability to ramp up to meet the requirements for munitions. But more broadly, there's been a recognition that defense industry in the United States has consolidated, perhaps even too far to meet the needs of great power competition and really what the U.S. military is going to need going forward. And in particular, when you look at the aerospace defense industry, do you think that more needs to be done to not only increase its capacity, but its resiliency?
They get two or three things mixed up in the question. They're kind of combined. One is the structure and the access we have to competitive sources. And I've been worried about that for a long time. When I was in the acquisition job, I was resisting some of the mergers that were taking place then. And I think that the philosophy on antitrust is changing a little bit here. At that time, the Justice Department's view was that if they're not building the same product or same class of products, we're not really losing competition. But we are losing independent actors when we combine defense companies. And we're changing the political dynamics of the industry relative to the department and the federal government. I don't see us undoing any past mergers. I don't want to panic anybody out there. That's not likely to happen. But I think we need to look carefully at mergers going forward for that reason. Now, there are plenty of times when mergers do make sense, and you end up with a stronger entity as a result of that. But there are cases when you get consequences that you don't like from the point of view of the government. In terms of capacity, the capacity we generate is determined by the investments we are making or are projected to make. And the more we can be certain and convey to industry what our plans are and how firm they are, the easier it is for them to go to their boards of directors and their shareholders and make capital investments consistent with that. One of the reasons I announced the 1,000 CCA planning figure last spring was to tell industry we're serious. So we want you to invest in the technology and think about how you're going to make a very efficiently produced product for us, and get started with investments to make yourself a stronger competitor for that. And I think that's worked. I think industry's looked at that and said, okay, they mean it, they're really going to go do this, so let's figure out how to make smart investments to be more competitive. At the end of the day, I think that's all you can expect from industry. They're not going to do it out of charity for us. They're going to do it because they see a return. That's what they're charged by their stockholders to do, and that's the way business works. But we can be smart about what we communicate and how clear and accurate we are. One of the things that always frustrated me in industry was, somebody in the government would announce some big thing that at the end of the day turned out to be not such a big thing, and they'd encourage you to go make investments, and then it wouldn't ultimately happen. So getting clear signals from the government, I think, is very helpful, particularly about things like what's going to go into production, what you're serious about. There's an infinite, roughly, cadre out there of people trying to sell things to us who are looking for signals and will often take signals from lower level people who actually can't commit the organization. So we got to be a little bit careful about that. The other thing on the capacity side is making investments in production capacity and so on. And we can do that on the margins. The things like the multi-year procurements are an economic benefit directly to the department. Those are a no-brainer, those are easy. Investing in other industrial capacity things for the sake of having industrial capacity is much harder for us to prioritize. Our budgets are, again, I come back to resources. I need money more than I need anything else. I need budgets passed more than I need anything else. We just don't have the discretion to do a great deal of that as much as we might like to.
Okay, so I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask you the last question. And it's going to go even farther. We've already talked about all the ways that we're failing to be able to meet what we anticipate as the current pacing challenge. My colleague Andrew Metrick recently, last week, released a report called Rolling the Iron Dice that is looking at and arguing that if the US and China were to get in a war, it would likely be protracted. And that, Ukraine is not necessarily an anomaly when you have great powers who have great resources. That combined with a host of other factors are likely to lead to a prolonged conflict. Is the Department of the Air Force beginning to think sort of beyond denial and about how to be prepared to win in a protracted war?
Let me give you my thoughts on that, and it'll take a second. The job one is deterrence. We don't want to have a war.
Absolutely.
And we don't think war is inevitable. And we think if we're strong in the right ways, we can prevent a war. We can be important. There's a very good article that Jake Sullivan and Kurt McConnell just wrote in Foreign Affairs about the relationship with China and how to manage that relationship. Make the point very strongly that we're not going into a Cold War type situation, that there is a military dimension to this conflict, and we definitely are in a contest for military superiority in the Western Pacific, and we have to take that seriously and modernize, but that a lot of the competition with China is going to be economic, and it's going to be about their authoritarian ideas versus our democratic ideas and so on. It's a really good piece that sets the framework for the relationship. Nobody, and certainly China nor the United States, wants a long war. And when you think about the war we're trying to deter, it's not the intent of China to have a long war. It would be the intent of China to, first of all, deter the United States and keep us from intervening. And then if we did intervene, defeat us very decisively and prevent our intervention from being successful. So job one for me is A, preserve deterrence, B, have the operational capability that if deterrence fails, we can defeat the Chinese aggressive action. But you have to keep in mind while you're thinking about all that, that you may end up in a longer conflict than you intended. You can't ignore that possibility, even though that's not your first priority. So for me, that means a hedging strategy. We can never afford in peacetime the military we would need for a long war with China. That's unrealistic. That's a mobilized, industrialized, set of capabilities. And remember, we're talking about a nuclear capable power here with nuclear weapons on the kinds of numbers that we have, not the small force that China had traditionally. So the best I think you can do is some hedging investments. And munitions capability is one of them. Key parts capability might be another. Programs like the CCAs might be another piece of that, where you could ramp up production and get significant quantities relatively quickly. We're not going to take the length of time it takes to get a new sophisticated crude fighter. That's going to be a couple of years. Ships are 5 years, roughly. Munitions, 1.5 years, depending upon the munition. So the prospect of a long war is not something you can ignore, but I don't think it's your first planning factor. It's one of the things you need to think about, though.
I agree completely. Well, I think we are coming up on time, so thank you so much, sir, for joining me. Thank
I'm
you
getting
to-
warm. I think it's the fire you
I
have
know,
over there.
it's our virtual fireplace
it's the
here
sun.
at CNAS. Thanks to everyone who has tuned in virtually and in person. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Stacie.